Council members, thank you again so much for doing this. Can we get your attention, please? This is important, folks. We've been hearing from the audience all day about how important rent control and stabilization and affordable housing is to them. I'm interested in the fact that right now we're in a situation where we have to renew the measure every 5 years, every 10 years, whatever it is. Why? Why do we do that? Why isn't it permanent? Should it be permanent? Councilmember White, you can go first. You have the microphone. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I just have one. How about on 3? 1, 2, 3.
Happy to go first. Thank you for the question. I'm not sure this microphone is on. Thank you. Yeah, as everyone knows, rent control expires. We have to really reauthorize it, kind of start over, have that battle over and over again. And the reality is, if we think rent control is a good idea, if we believe rent control is preserving housing, then it's something that we have to make permanent, so we don't have to go down this road every several years. I do think that we have to look at other jurisdictions that have started to do this already, see if there are any issues that they have faced. I've not heard of any, but see if there are any lessons that we can learn from other jurisdictions that have already begun to make this permanent.
All right, fair enough. Anybody else want to address that?
Yeah,
Councilmember
yes.
Che?
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
First of all, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you're enjoying your lunch. I'm delighted to be here. As the matter of rent control goes forward, I'm happy, in fact, delighted if we could make it permanent. But I just want to entertain two pieces of, caution, I guess. One is, I want to make sure, and Councilmember White perhaps in his statement was alluding to this, I'm not sure, but I want to make sure that we don't run afoul of any constitutional issues about takings if we make it permanent. So sometimes you have to make the case for it every so often. But if that's not an impediment, that's great. But if it is, we'll want to make sure we're not putting ourselves in jeopardy. And second, although I'm in favor of, if we can, making it permanent, the occasion for renewing it is not just a battle where we have to do it, because I think the District of Columbia and the legislature is totally committed to this. But by the same token, maybe it might focus our attention, although we could do it some other way, it might focus our attention on how we might expand rent control, expand the numbers of buildings and tenants who, yes, let's hear for that. Now, it doesn't have to have that as the occasion, but if there was any benefit to it at all, that's the only one that I would see. Otherwise, I would support making it permanent.
It's interesting to me, you make a good point. We talked about earlier today that rent stabilization is 100 years old. And it was all about making sure there was enough affordable housing, but the problem has not gotten better. In fact, you can make the argument it's gotten worse. So what is it that we're not doing? What's wrong with rent control as it stands? Because it hasn't worked, I think, as people hoped. Elizabeth Silverman, you can.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Oh, not sure this is still working.
Take your ears off.
Well, let me just say, hello, everyone. Thanks, Derek. Well, so first of all, I think everyone in this room probably agrees the rent is too damn high, right? Yes. Yeah, let's get some hand clapping for that. I mean, it's not something we should clap about because we want to make sure our city is affordable for everyone. And as Mary said, one of the big problems with rent control is that it's bifurcated, right? So if you live in an older building, you're under rent control. If you live in a new building, you're not. We have to figure this out because it's a matter of fairness. Where you live dictates whether you're under rent control or not. And you're often not thinking about, is my building built in 1970 or 1980 or 1990? But I feel like I could go on and on this topic. I think we need to make sure rent control is doing what it is intended to do, which is try to continue to make this city affordable for working people in this city. And then we have to make sure that buildings are maintained properly too. You shouldn't live in a rent control building and feel like, well, because I'm under rent control, I'm not allowed to have good, a working building that meets our building code. But I'm going to stop there, Derek, and maybe we'll have other questions to go on.
Well, I mean, let everybody address that. I mean, why hasn't it worked as we hoped? Is it a supply issue? What's going on?
Well, from my,
Can I talk to?
Ms. Nadeau, Councilmember Nadeau hasn't spoken yet. So.
And then I'll make sure to leave some room for Mary to answer too. So, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this question of should we make it permanent? You know, should we do it every 10 years? And the one thing that I keep coming back to is even though we're sort of still dealing with the same issue 100 years later, I think every 10 years we learn a little bit more about what we need. And so my concern about making it permanent is just like, you don't want it to be a set and forget kind of thing. We want people to stay engaged, and we want to be able to improve the law each time we have that opportunity. So I'm sort of torn on it. And I can tell you this time around, a lot of the things that I'm thinking about are how do we take some of the burden off tenants in rent-controlled buildings? Because look, we have an aging housing stock. In Ward 1, the average age of a rent-controlled unit is 89 years, right? And so if that unit hasn't been completely gutted, you know that it's just being held together with chewing gum and duct tape, and that's not good for the tenant. And so we have to look at some of these loopholes. And I will say this, the Housing Committee has been talking and talking and talking about some of these issues with rent control ever since I got on the council. We need to take some action, and we need to use this renewal as an opportunity to close some of those loopholes and take that pressure off the tenants. You know, government should be contributing more to maintaining units. Property owners should be contributing more. We can't allow, every time, you know, a unit needs to be repaired, we can't allow the burden of that to be on the tenant. So we have to sort that out, and we're going to have to really, as council members, lead on this, because it's not popular in every room. It's popular in this room, but it's not popular in every room to say this burden shouldn't be on the tenants. So that's...
Thank you very much. Just some quick numbers. The Urban Institute says that Washington as a region will need to add some 374,000 housing units by the year 2030. 3/4 of those need to be low to moderate income. Now that's not the city, that's the whole region, but I think you can safe to say a lot of those need to be in DC. What could be done to put us at least on track to getting in front of something like that?
I'd be happy to start on that. I also chair the Regional Council of Governments. We recently passed, this month, passed a resolution with elected officials from the entire region committing to meeting that mark, and which is a big deal. It's a big deal. And one of the things that we have to do is be more strategic. We only have so much money. We realize that the private sector is not going to build low-income housing because there's not a profit there. That means that government has to take the primary responsibility for that construction. The market is, as we all see, building a lot of luxury housing. So we don't have to really contribute a lot to that. What we do need to do is find better partnerships to meet the middle. Because working class folks in this city, it's crazy that we live in a place where you could make $80,000, $90,000 and still struggle to find somewhere to live. And so you have people making $25,000, people making $90,000 struggling together, and frankly the people making $90,000 are taking the living spaces of those who are making less. So we have to focus a lot more in the middle, make sure that we don't divide ourselves, that we recognize we have to build low-income housing and moderate-income housing and get both of them done.
Doesn't the city own some land that could be used this way? I mean, I know you talk about not being able to make it add up monetarily for the developer, but if you build on city land, can't you push developers to do it a different way, or give them the land for cheap, or do something?
we have a whole suite of things that we can do, and that's why rent control has to be maintained and expanded. But in addition, in dealing with getting housing built, what we need to do is think about all of the levers that we have. Some might be incentives, some might be simply regulatory requirements, but it's not one thing. We have to move on a broad front to confront this problem, because it is a crisis. And so when you said before something about why is rent control, I don't know, maybe not doing enough or failing, there are a lot of reasons for that, and that can be addressed, but that of itself is not going to be enough. We need to have all of these things put in play with the government at the lead.
So I would jump in and echo what Councilmember Shea says. I mean, for anyone who's lived in the district a long time, like Georgia Avenue, right, Councilmember Nadeau, looks a lot different, right? Because we didn't preserve the affordable housing there, right? It turned into luxury condos in the upper God knows what. And so here's, I think, I agree with Robert, we need to be strategic. So first thing, like the tenants at Girard Street, right, it was really hard for you to put together that Dopa deal, I imagine, right? We need to make it easier for you guys. So Dopa is great law, but it's hard to do, as any of the tenants who've organized here know. So we need to get Dopa up and running. I want to thank Polly Donaldson, and I know Daniela's here for moving that. So what is it? It's a terrible acronym, that's what it is. But what is Dopa? What is it? It's saying, you know what, the city should step in and preserve affordable housing. That's basically the easiest way to say it. So instead of putting the burden on you guys, we say we need this building to be preserved. We don't want it to be luxury apartments in the upper 800s. And so we are going to step in as a city, pause the sale, and then marry you guys, if you're the tenants in the building, with a nonprofit developer so we can save that affordable housing. That's been one of the biggest things we haven't done as a city. But we need to save whatever affordable housing, the buildings that you guys are in, we need to make sure they remain affordable. And then as Councilmember Che said, there's not just one strategy here. There's a lot of strategies. I think in Councilmember White, the work he's been doing leading at the Council of Governments, we need to work with private landlords, but developers have made a lot of money in our city. They have. And it's time for it to be a little bit more equitable in terms of the benefits to the city as well as the benefits to our development community.
Councilmember Nadeau.
So thanks, Councilmember Silverman, for teeing me up on an issue that I'm really excited about. I represent Lower Georgia Avenue. We are just next month, October, kicking off our Lower Georgia Avenue Equitable Development Planning process, which is a fancy way of saying we want people who've lived here to stay here. We want businesses that have been in our community to stay, and we're going to make a plan for that, and we're going to make it replicable so other neighborhoods can do it. So stay with me on that. I agree with everything my colleagues said, and I'm going to add one more topic, which is one of my soapboxes they are so tired of hearing me talk about, and that is the very unsexy comprehensive plan that we are going through this process in the city right now. If you don't know what that is, and you care about affordable housing, you need to learn about this. So every 10 years or so, give or take, we review the blueprint for the city, where you can build, how you can build, why you should build. And we are going through that process right now, and I can tell you that in October, we are going to be starting to look at what is called the land use element, and that tells us where we can build. There are entire parts of the city right now where all you can build is one house on a piece of land. We in the city need to be building everywhere, right? We have focused on affordable housing, right? But we need to be building all kinds of housing because we need people who can afford more to pay more, and not be tying up the housing that costs less for all the people that need it, right? And part of what the COG is doing under Councilmember White's leadership is saying, all right, these are the goals we have for the region. The District of Columbia has to make our own roadmap for how we're going to hold up our end of that deal, and it is critically important that people who care about housing are part of this conversation. So you will see the council will be holding a hearing on the comprehensive plan land use element, and I hope you will come out and talk about the importance of building more housing and making it easier to build more housing in the District of Columbia, and prioritizing things like building first and the right to return and multifamily housing and family-sized housing, because now is the time to have that conversation. Thank you.
Got a couple of questions from the audience here, and council members, whoever wants to take these can feel free to step in. This person asks, is it true that the voucher program for low-income residents allows landlords to ignore rent control for the units rented? Is this temporary or permanent? What is the city council doing about this? When will it close this landlord-friendly loophole?
Well, I think we have. So We have. It was the case that if you had a voucher and the voucher recipient left that unit in a rent-controlled building, then the landlord was allowed to take that unit and bring it up to market rate. But that loophole has been closed
Fair enough.
We passed a law.
by legislation.
Yeah, we passed a law.
You know, it feels like to me, and I'll get some more audience questions in a second, that somehow we fell behind on this thing. I have lived in this city my whole life. I used to live at Kansas and Shepherd back in the 90s, and that neighborhood was not that great, I'll be honest and tell you. And it's a lot different now.
Well, that was after you left.
It was, yeah. Yeah, it started going uphill, I noticed, the minute I moved out. Things went better. But seriously, how did we fall behind when the city began to turn around and so many people began to move back in? How did we fall behind, it seems like, for handling these issues?
One of the things I believe, it's a theory I've heard that I'm still researching, is that there was a gap in time where we didn't build a lot in our city. And so generally, if a building is built, you know, it might cost a little more to live in, but as it gets older, it costs less and less, and people move to the newer buildings. Well, we do have a gap in time where we didn't have a lot of construction in our city. And so a theory that I've heard that I'm still investigating is that we don't have kind of a naturally aging housing stock, and that has really kind of put us behind. So you have a lot of older, very dilapidated buildings, and you have a lot of brand new buildings that came right during and right after the Great Recession.
But I'll add one thing. All right, so I like to tell anybody who will listen that I'm in the middle of reading Chocolate City, and it's taking forever because it's a very long. Have you seen this book? It's like bigger than my dictionary, but it's really good. Every 100 years or so you get into this book, it's like repeating history, right? I mean, we are having some of the same problems right now that they were having after World War II, that they were having, you know, after Reconstruction, and that is racism. That is inequity in job availability, and it is all these measures of poverty that are tied to housing, right, that are related to housing, but it's not just the housing. And I think we're in a really important time in the District of Columbia. First of all, none of us were here 100 years ago, so I can tell you, Mary, you're not that old. But we are focused very much now in this government on race equity, okay? And what that means is we're looking at all of our institutions and thinking about how has racism impacted the situation we're in now, and how can we change that? And I think that that's a critical part of the conversation. You know, our back to the comp plan, our zoning map was written in 1920, and it was based on neighborhoods as they existed, which were based on redlining and what's the covenants, you know, restrictive covenants. And we have an opportunity to fix that, but we have to stay focused on it, and I think that's going to make a big difference.
Derek, we make it out like gentrification in this city sort of just happened like immaculate conception. It didn't just happen. We spent money, we put money as a city into Columbia Heights, and that heated up the housing market. You know, we put money into the Green Line Metro, right? That was a deliberate strategy, but we didn't. So we wanted people to come to the city, but we didn't think about, well, how are we going to keep the people who are currently here in the city? You know, I just have to say, it's like, and look, 20 years ago, I was just talking to a group of folks who were learning about the Revitalization Act. I mean, how many hands of people who were here in 1996? Right? Okay, a lot of you guys remember the city was in a financial crisis, right? And we had a deliberate strategy at that point to basically attract, I think at the time they were called DINKs, dual income, no kids, right? So our strategy was we wanted people who didn't need many city services and who would live in luxury housing so that we would get their income and property tax revenue. Right? And that was a strategy to save the city, but it's not a strategy to make a fair and equitable city. And we need to turn the strategy around. Mayor Williams has been interviewed about this a lot, in that, you know, Mayor Williams executed that strategy, but we see the result of it. which is a city that is very inequitable, a city that has housing that is not in balance, right? We have, as my colleague said, we have a lot of luxury housing, and then we have rent control housing that's falling apart, and then new buildings aren't even under rent control. So I say, instead of us saying like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? Oh, wow. Let's say no, actually it happened by, a deliberate strategy, and now let's be more strategic, as my at-large colleague said. Let's actually be strategic. What kind of city do we want to have? Do we want to have a city where you guys have a place? I think we do. So we need to execute policies, and we need to be smart about how we do that.
So, well, speaking of that, I got a great question from the audience here. Why can't the council put more laws that say if you build and get those sweet tax deals, you must give a higher percentage to rental units that are affordable?
That's exactly right. We could. We could. Well,
Who wants to address that?
I mean, we could and we should look at it, and I don't know that there's more to say. I think it's a good idea. I mean, we have inclusionary zoning in place right now, and it's not been, we've been tweaking it over the past 5 years or so that we're finally getting it into a good place, and so maybe it is time to look at it and see if we can expand it. We also have our own law with our own land, and so when we dispose of government property, you have to build a higher amount of affordable housing. I have a bill that is pending that would apply that to all quasi-governmental entities too. So WMATA, they're doing a big land dump. All their land should be subject to that. DC Water, whoever's getting rid of land that's sort of a governmental entity, housing authority perhaps, right? So I think we always need to be doing more, and we're continuously looking at that and thinking about other ways we can do it.
A lot of people are asking the similar sort of questions. If you give businesses like the hotel, like the
The Line Hotel.
Yeah, the Line Hotel, that's it. Why not give housing developers a similar break and to build more affordable housing?
We do.
well, the issue is that the Line Hotel was supposed to give us jobs, and they didn't. We got to expect more. We got to be better I think what I'm hearing from you guys is we got to be better negotiators, right? We do. We do need to be better negotiators. Because you guys are seeing these big buildings being built, and you're not seeing the jobs that come out of it, and then you're not seeing the affordable housing. And you're right. We need to be better negotiators when we're coming to the table with our development community.
Councilmember Che, this one was aimed at you. The Eviction Record Sealing Authority Amendment Act of 2019. Could you talk about it, and if anybody else wants to get in it as well?
Sure. The problem of evictions is very serious, both in terms of someone suffering an eviction, but also someone trying to rent thereafter. Now, the first line of defense is to prevent evictions, so that if people have some incident or something and they need emergency rent supplement or whatever it is to prevent it. But sometimes it happens. And under the current situation, our Superior Court judges do not have the authority to seal eviction records. So my bill would say, after 3 years, they are automatically sealed, and the judge has no discretion, they're automatically sealed. And then even in that interim period, let's say an eviction was sought but not obtained, or a settlement was obtained, or it was sought under the wrong, under bad arguments and was dismissed, whatever it was, that is still on your record. But as to those, the person who was evicted can move to have that sealed too. Now, in terms of evictions and sealing of records, it occurred to me that, the landlord community, they have their own communications. They have their own way of finding out stuff, so to speak. And so even though the bill would say you cannot, that these records are sealed, what if a landlord finds out that you suffered an eviction, even though your record has now been sealed? So I had to tack on a little provision there under the Human Rights Act saying you cannot discriminate against someone based upon a sealed eviction record. So that's what it's all about.
That's great.
I thought that deserved a bit more enthusiastic.
Just very quickly on that, Councilmember, how do you ensure the landlord's going to say, hey, wait a second, I have a right to know whether somebody's going to be a reliable tenant, the same way I can check credit records, the same way I can check.
You know what?
How do you balance that?
We expunge criminal records. We give people in bankruptcy a fresh start. This is of the same character. When the landlord says, I have a right, where is it written? Is that some constitutional right? I can tell you it is not. And therefore, legislatively, we can say that they shall be sealed after a certain period of time, which I think is quite reasonable.
It's always good to have a constitutional lawyer on your city council.
All right. This one is from another audience member. The council members' comments focus on affordable housing for low-income residents, but even low income means people who make 50 to 80% of the area median, and that is not affordable for huge numbers of people. There's no provision for very low and extremely low income earners. Many people, even professional people, are in that income level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation is what do you mean when you say the word affordable housing, right? And so when I'm talking about it in my ward, my big focus has been for people making less than $30,000 a year, families making less than $30,000 a year. A lot of the work we do is a little bit higher, around $50,000, some is even $80,000. You know, I think the thing that we all in this room know is that everybody in those income bands are struggling. Right? You're struggling as a family of four if you're making $80,000 to find housing. So we need to build all of it. As my colleague, Councilmember White, said earlier, you know, those middle income brackets are really important too. I don't think anyone has taken their eye off the ball when it comes to that lowest bracket of housing. But the conversation today, I think, is about all of it.
Is there a supply issue that might be helped if there were not a height limit in Washington, D.C.? Somebody asked this earlier.
Ooh,
People
can
we
I
talked
answer
to
this
said
one?
no, but there's other opinions out there. Go
So I
ahead.
have a very passionate opinion about this. I apologize. I'm just going to jump on this one. So here's the thing that you need to remember. With the height limit remaining intact, today we could actually double the amount of housing we have if we changed our zoning code. Okay? So focus on that for now, because the height limit is not something we have the ability to change, but we can change the way we build housing in the District of Columbia, where we build it. We could double it right now with the height limit still intact.
And that does, go ahead.
And if I could just add one other thing that all of us need to think about, we recognize that we do need to build more housing. We do need to focus especially on low income and moderate income housing. But in a small city that is landlocked, that means that when we move from a broader conversation to a more specific conversation, that means that there may be a new or more dense apartment building down the street from us, or there may be a house that turns into a pop-up. And I do hear from residents who don't like that change in character. And so this really is a team effort that we all have to really think about together. What is our highest need? Do we need more to preserve what our blocks look like, or do we need more to create more housing that people can afford? There's not an easy answer to that. It's not a question that I should answer for you or for anybody else. It's a question that we have to answer together, but we have to answer it quickly.
Before we do that, I just want to announce and recognize that Councilman from Ward 7 and former Mayor Vince Gray has come in, and he's going to join us right here on stage. Hey, thank you for coming, man.
It's like Survivor here.
Yeah.
Who gets voted off the island? Who gets on the island?
All right.
Hey, Vince.
This is perfect. Thank you for coming, Councilman Gray.
He has two mics. What's that about?
Whoa. Neither one of them.
Patriarchy. It's the patriarchy.
I want to ask this question. There's a survey recently came out that said a majority of citizens believe that affordable housing or public housing or whatever you want to call it is clustered in one or two parts of town, and it's not fair. That it should be spread all over the city. And people feel like, you know, why is it always east of the river? And I wondered if you guys had an opinion on this, and are there thoughts on making sure that these projects are spread out more evenly? And it goes to what you said about the neighborhoods, right? People don't want, you know, realistically, there's a NIMBY situation, right? Not in my backyard. So how do you deal with that?
Well, that's what I was talking about with the comp plan. So The zoning map doesn't allow us to build housing more than one house at a time in a large part of the city. And if we could change that, you wouldn't feel the same pressures to build bigger complexes all in just a couple places, like Ward 1. And let me just say this, Ward 1 has single-family homes, the ward I represent, but it doesn't have any zoning that limits us to building only single-family homes.
So where are those limits?
I'm not going to name check or call out any wards today because I'm trying to be cordial. Ward 3. But here's the thing. This is the conversation we're going to be having on the council around the comprehensive plan. Where should we be able to build housing? Now, if you ask me, I'd say everywhere. But not everybody agrees with me. And so we as a community have to decide how we want our city to look.
I mean, oh, I'm sorry, Mary.
No, I just wanted to say something, since I wanted to confess that probably the reference was to Ward 3.
Not alone.
And Ward 7.
And Ward 7.
And 5 and 4.
And 5 and 4. And yeah, like a lot of places.
You're not alone.
But I wanted to say that I used to have a little mini debate with Councilmember Graham. I sat next to him for many years about who had more apartments, big, large apartments. I think it's Ward 3. He always maintained it was Ward 1.
I'm not going to fight with you.
Why not? Why not?
Because I love you.
But the point is that it's not the case that it's just one kind of housing, single-family housing on lots. Right. We have tons of multiple housing spots, and more than Jim Graham's claim to the contrary, more than any other ward, actually. So, the other thing I would say about the single-family house on one lot, what we have found in Ward 3 is that if you allow for more, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get affordable housing, multiple unit housing, or anything like that. You know what you get over in Ward 3 that we're seeing lots of? A landlord an owner will buy a plot, knock down the kind of modest, nice house, and build 2, mega mansions. So I don't know that this unlocks exactly what you're hoping that it will unlock. It may have a byproduct effect that's quite different. So just a word of caution.
This is a preview of the conversation we'll be having on the council around the land use element.
Well, I know Vince wants to jump in. Let me just say that it comes down to land values, right? It's less expensive for developers to purchase land and to make deals in Ward 7 and 8 than it is in other parts of our city. And it gets back to what kind of city we want to live in, right? It is a little bit more expensive to build in Ward 1 or Ward 3, but we need to have affordable housing in every ward in this city, right? And so it's about values, in my opinion. It's about what kind of city do we want to be, and we do. Once again, we have to be using all the tools in the tool chest. One of the ways that we gap finance to either do the deals, the Dopa deals that some of you guys have been a part of, or the other plain new production of housing is the Housing Production Trust Fund. I don't know, we got here now, so I don't know if Polly Donaldson, director of DHCD, has been recognized, but Polly is running that fund. It's a big tool in our toolkit. But it comes back to, Derek, it comes back to land values. And, we have to make if we want to have a city where affordable housing is in every ward, that's the city I think all 4 of us believe we need to have. We have to make different kinds of investments in different kinds of...
Don't you have to be willing to, for lack of a better word, piss off some people who have a lot of money and influence right now and don't want that housing in their neighborhood?
Well, I'm never one that... That's your calling card, Silverman.
Yeah.
Ask the mayor.
I just had to bring it up. Councilman Gray, go ahead. Get on this. I my microphone.
Here you go. I'll take this one.
I worry some days that the term affordable housing isn't becoming like a cliche. I have people who live in my ward in Ward 7 who now are equating affordable housing with public housing. Not that there's anything wrong with public housing. I don't mean that. I'm just saying that we need to be clear about what affordable housing really means to folks also. One of the things I think we desperately need, Derek, is we need workforce housing. We have lots of people who would like to live in this city and they can't any longer afford to live in the city. We got firefighters. If you look at the numbers, we have 24% of our firefighters who actually live in the District of Columbia. Our police officers, we actually have 16% of the police officers who actually live in the District of Columbia, which means, obviously, just do the rough math, and you have 84% who don't live in the District of Columbia. And we have lots of our public education teachers who don't live in the District of Columbia anymore. You know, I have a bill now that I would love to see be able to move, obviously. I wouldn't have introduced it in the first place, and that is a bill that says that if our first responders, if they live in the District of Columbia, if our firefighters live in the District of Columbia, if our police officers live in the District of Columbia, they would not have to pay any DC income taxes as a result, as long as they live in the District of Columbia. I mean, we want people to live in our midst and be a part of the communities that they serve. And what a great way to be able to do that is if we can get them to take advantage of a bill that would eliminate their taxes. So
Well, we got 3 other council members here. Would you guys support that?
Sure, probably did. Don't remember.
I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but
that's okay. Put it on the spot. Okay.
I hadn't thought, I didn't know about it. I don't just do things on the stage.
Sure.
Of course.
So possibly, but I'd have to think about it.
Well, it's understandable.
It doesn't sound like this is going to be revenue neutral, right? I mean, it sounds like this would cost the city perhaps a significant amount of money, and the more people you guys take advantage of it, ironically, the more it's going to cost you.
But look at what it's costing us now for all of these people who serve the District of Columbia, earn their salaries from the government of the District of Columbia, and then live outside of the city. You know, and there's some people who will say that, no, folks are probably not going to, you know, they put down roots wherever they've moved to and they're going to stay there. And there's probably some truth to that. But when you look at the fact that we are looking to increase our first responders, increase our police officers and our firefighters and our EMTs in the District of Columbia, using our cadet program, using our high school programs, those are young people who will be coming out of school and then be able to live in the District of Columbia in an affordable way.
You know, I remember, and I don't know how many, I'm sure a lot of people here remember when, if you worked for DC government, you had to live in town. There was a requirement. If you put that in place now, I think a lot of people couldn't do it. I guess the point I'm making that you have to have the housing before you can. The people are going to move back, be able to move back in.
You have to have the, can I borrow that for a second? No.
I'll just go.
Thanks, Eric. Well, you have to have the housing and you have to have the schools. And I'll say one concern I have, maybe about this approach is a lot of people move out of our city for housing costs and because they have young families. So I want to make sure that we're making the investment. We have an inequitable school system right now, where if you live in a certain part of the city, you feel comfortable with your traditional public schools. If you live in another part of the city, you're going into our game of chance called the schools lottery. That's not a school system. So I am concerned about a revenue loss, because I think we need to be looking at making sure we're making sound investments in our schools. It's tied to housing. It's tied to the racism that Councilmember Nadeau talked about. But my concern, Derek, sort of moving forward in our city is that we have a lot of older residents who feel like they can't afford to stay. We have a lot of younger residents who feel like they can't afford to move up to the next form of housing, and they don't feel they're unsure about the school as well. They feel like it's a game of chance with their children, and that's not a good feeling to have.
That's good.
I think though, Derek, if we recognize that, you know, we're trying to encourage more of our first responders to stay in the city in the first place. It is a fact that if they've already bought a home in, you know, in Northern Virginia or Prince George's County or Montgomery County, it's unlikely that they're going to give that up and move back in the District of Columbia. But we're also hopefully attracting a number of young people coming through our high schools who will become first responders. They already live in the city as a result of going to our schools. And we should be able to create incentives. We can create incentives for them to be able to stay in the District of Columbia. And who knows, you know, as they move from whatever they're in at that point, they may just buy a house in the District of Columbia. I mean, I think it's unconscionable for us to say that 84% of our police officers don't even live in the District of Columbia. And the fact that we have so many of our firefighters, EMS workers, emergency medical workers who don't live in the District of Columbia, that's dangerous. I mean, you think about the fact that if we have a real emergency and then people can't get back in the city because they don't live in the city or even live close to it. So many of our firefighters actually don't even live close to the city. They actually live in other states.
Well, because they work inside.
Yeah, well, yeah, they do.
They only have to come into work 1 out of 4 days.
Is there accountability? I don't know how much money the city spends on housing off the top of my head, but I'm sure they spend a good bit. Is there accountability for the outcome of that money? In other words, I can say we spent this much money, but what did we get for that amount of money?
Well, we know that there's actually when I was mayor, I was the first one to put in $100 million a year for affordable housing, and it's been sustained since this current administration has been in place.
So what have we
And I
gotten for
appreciate
that?
it. Well, you've gotten a lot of housing that's been built. I don't know what quantification you're looking for, Derek, but it's a good question. We ought to be able to quantify what the outcomes are, other than people just saying they got a roof over their heads.
So we have quantified, there's been a lot of study. I think the answer is we've got mixed results, right? And we have to keep doing better. And I know, I see Alyssa's got some thoughts on this too, but I just, we've studied it, and we have the housing director here, so I know she will, you know, she's got the same numbers we have, which is to say the trust fund has funded thousands of affordable housing units, but the money hasn't always gone to those units, and we have to think about what is the mix, what does it mean if we need to be spending money on less affordable units in order to get the lower income units? Should we be putting more money in the pot if that's how it actually works, right? So I think we're still learning a lot. It's only been a handful of years since we've had the $100 million in the trust fund. It's only been a handful of years since we've been able to move that money out the door. And we're growing, but I think it's mixed results.
I'll just say we need to spend our money better. And I do want to give accolades to Director Donaldson. Fact of the matter is we were putting $100 million into the Housing Production Trust Fund, but we weren't following the law. We weren't building the housing we were supposed to build. So, you know, Director, you should give some hand claps to Director Donaldson and her team at DHCD. Yes, because we have started to follow the law. But we, you know, it gets back to we just need to use every tool and then more tools. You know, we need to make sure when we do inclusionary zoning, this is like when you see one of those big buildings go up, there is a legal amount of money that, given how many units they have, they're supposed to make affordable. But we need to hold them to it, and we need to make sure they do it. And then when it comes to our capital projects, you know, we just overspend your taxpayer dollars all the time, you know? And we need to make sure when we're building schools, when we're building projects, we stay within budget, just like you guys have to stay within your budget.
When you talk about all the big buildings going up and following the law and the zoning and that kind of thing, I'm like everybody else. I see these huge buildings go up around town, and I always assume that they're going to be very expensive, and most people are not going to be able to afford to live there. Are you saying that it doesn't have to be that way?
Well, I mean, we have a law, it's a snoozer name, inclusionary zoning, but what it means is that if you're building a building that has more than 10 units, there's a certain percentage of units in that building that need to be affordable. But you know, it's not a very low affordability, but it's that workforce housing, Derek. But one of the things we could do is, and in fact we worked with, and this was a zone, I hate using the word zoning because I feel like everyone zones out when the word zoning comes up. But we increased what we were getting out of inclusionary zoning. We worked with the Zoning Commission on that. But we need to negotiate. If we're putting your dollars into a deal, we need to make sure that we're getting the most. Let me give you an example where we haven't negotiated well. Who's been to Nats Park and the neighborhood around there? So does that neighborhood look a lot different than it did 10 years ago? Yeah, it sure does, right? And, okay, we had a deal that came before us a few months ago where the developer was basically, the deal got a little stalled, and they came to us with the same amount of affordable housing that was in the deal 10 years ago. And I was like, come on now. The land values around Nats Park have dramatically increased. You should be able to pencil out more affordable housing than it was 10 years ago. And that's where I think we need to spend your taxpayer dollars.
What
better.
finally happened? What was the result?
You know, it's amazing, Derek. They somehow found the math could be a little bit different, and they added some more affordable units into the project.
We're going to finish up in a couple of minutes, but I want to ask you, as you look at renewing rent control again, are there specific things that any of you are thinking of that need to be strengthened or changed this time around to accommodate our different market and perhaps create more low-income or affordable housing, or at least keep it from getting any worse than it is now?
Well, you know, I've seen over the years that I've been on the council that every time we pass legislation to assist buildings to maintain rent control or otherwise fix items that are problematic, it's amazing to me the creativity of the owners of the property, how they quickly find some other loophole. So I suppose we would have to have a whole list, but among the things that are still problematic are when the landlord, and you know there are limits, but it keeps happening. I see it happening all the time, where the landlords make it untenable for tenants to remain, and then once they get down to a certain number, they negotiate with the remaining tenants for them to remain at a certain rent, but that they can increase the rents so much more. Things like that, little games that are played, and it's done over and over and over again. There's an issue here about enforcement, though. I mean, some of the laws that we have could be effective if we were to enforce them. I don't see the level of enforcement.
Councilman Nadeau?
So I was going to say something else, but I actually would like to build on what Councilmember Che said, because I have legislation pending now, the Homeowners and Tenants Protection Act, that would actually increase the number of DCRA rental housing inspectors, so that the ratio of inspectors is tied to the number of rental units in the city, which seems like kind of obvious, right? But we don't do it. We are woefully understaffed. Every year we have increased the number of housing inspectors that I've been on the council, and we need to keep doing it. But let's tie it to something real, like the number of housing units, right? The rental housing units. So there's some things with rent control that we need to be thinking about. I won't claim to have come up with these myself, because there's a lot of incredible advocates in this room who've been working hard on this. But here's an obvious one. Only allow one rent increase a year for all rental housing in the district. Most people don't realize that's not the case now. Your rent could go up a couple times a year if you're in the right type of building. So that should be a no-brainer. There's still a number of loopholes in the petition process for rent increases. Eliminating vacancy increases is an issue that keeps coming up. Expanding the scope of rent control to protect more tenants, so the newer buildings, right? We have to think about the current housing stock. And of course, this room has been a champion of the idea of eliminating the 2% on top of CPI. So I think we're going to be looking at all these things again, right? I mean, it's going to be the same conversations we've been having ever since I got on the council, but we have to make some decisions, some tough ones, about which of these things we're going to do. And move. I mean, stop talking and start doing.
Councilman Gray? You don't have anything that the law needs to be strengthened, or you don't?
Well, I like the fact that we are actually going to extend it for a longer period of time than we have in the past. And I would love to see us add more units in there. I think that we have to go back to 1976 when buildings were built in order to be able to get the protected group of units that are in there. You know, I was thinking about this a little earlier. I worked very closely with the Office of the Tenant Advocate for some time. Even when I first came on the council, I worked closely with them, and they have done a phenomenal job of protecting people. I remember my brother, who is now passed on. He was quite an organizer. He actually did everything he could. He lived on 35th Street, northeast, in an apartment, and he was very active in working with the tenants who lived in those buildings out there. And he actually helped to represent them in court. And the upshot of this was that what he was rewarded for his great work with all these people was he came home one day, and the ownership, the management folks had set him up, and he was evicted. And I had to rent a truck and go out to 35th Street and actually get everything he owned was on the street. And he never had a place that he lived in of his own. He lived with my mother after that. And it's unconscionable things like that you know, may continue to exist. So I want to look at what is it that we can do to continue to protect people against the possibility of being evicted like my brother was. I almost feel like having a law named for him, the James Gray eviction precedents.
Alyssa Silverman?
I think I've said enough.
Okay. Can we just get a round of applause and thanks to our council members? Breonna Nadeau, Mary Che, Vince Gray, Alyssa Silverman, and Robert White, who had to go. Brandon Todd was here also, he had to go. I want to thank all of y'all for coming. It's been great. We appreciate your time.
And thanks to our moderator. Yes.